Hi everyone, welcome to the February 2nd edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski. And Craig, there are a lot of Derby preps lined up for this weekend. I think we were originally supposed to have 3 of them. Now it's 4, with Oaklawn moving the Southwest Stakes back a week. And actually, Oaklawn is going to be the focus of our podcast this week, talking about that late pick 5 sequence. But it kind of feels like with the calendar turning from January to February, suddenly we're going to be having a lot of conversations about this 3-year-old division.
For sure. We kind of mentioned it after we recapped the Pegasus. That's going to be the focus probably from now until the beginning of May, because not a whole lot going on for older horses, at least in this country. And I say the Derby, plenty of filly races as well for 3-year-old fillies, which I think there's one in the sequence we're going to talk about. But yeah, the focus is firmly on the 3-year-olds for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and we'll be discussing the Southwest Stakes as part of this Pick 5 sequence at Oaklawn Park. The Southwest, I think, is the most fun to handicap of the 4 Derby preps taking place this weekend, although the Withers came up a better field than I was expecting it to at Aqueduct. But, Craig, I think we're going to see 2 of the best 3-year-olds in action, not in Hot Springs, Arkansas, but rather in Florida and California this weekend, in last year's 2-year-old champion Fierceness, who was going to be a heavy favorite, probably 1-5 in the Holy Bull Stakes on Saturday at Gulfstream. And then out in California, Bob Baffert's got that Nisos, who looks like a monster in the first 2 races that we've seen out of him. He'll be stretching out the 2 turns for the first time. Obviously, as of now, and the way the rules are currently being enforced, Nisos is not going to be in the Kentucky Derby this year, but still it's going to be interesting to see how these 3-year-olds develop.
Sure, because the Derby is just one race, and maybe Nisos dominates and winds up in the Preakness or the Belmont, and certainly in later races in the summer. So it's not like we can ignore those races. And after all, he still appears to be a very good horse, and I'm interested to see him run because he's run 2 huge numbers, and want to see if he can back it up.
Yeah, I was really impressed watching some of his last few races once again, and some of his workouts leading up to it. I did a stakes preview of that race this week. I actually filmed videos for all 4 of these Derby preps. You can check those out on the Daily Racing Form YouTube channel. That's part of the TimeformUS Road to the Derby series that I do every year. So my picks for all those races are out there somewhere, but Craig and I will do a deep dive into one of those, the Southwest Stakes, as part of this Pick 5 sequence. And in this Pick 5, we've got 4 stakes to talk about. As Craig was alluding to, we've also got the Martha Washington for the 3-year-old fillies. That's the second leg. A couple of sprint stakes races for older horses, leading things off with the King Cotton, which drew a very strong field for a listed stakes race. The American Beauty a bit later on. That has more of a standout, but also a high-quality runner in there as well for a listed stakes. And then we close things out the final leg of the sequence with one of these typical wide-open allowance races going 2 turns at Oaklawn. It feels like these come up a dime a dozen at Oaklawn, and there's one that's part of this Pick 5 sequence. So we'll have to get to that at the end and hopefully make sense of it. Fingers crossed, because this does not feel like it's an easy sequence by any means, especially with that Southwest Stakes being part of it. I mean, we'll get to our opinions in that leg, Craig, but I certainly found it to be one of the more wide open races in the sequence.
I agree. I think earlier on, we'll get to how we handicap it, but maybe it's a little more manageable earlier on. And then at the end, it just gets to be typical Oaklawn Park racing with big competitive fields. There's a difference. Sometimes we get big fields, but there's a couple standouts, but I don't really think that's the case here.
Yeah, it does feel like there are maybe 1 or 2 potential singles or close to singles in this sequence, if you want to look at it that way. One of us will be against a few of those favorites. We'll see about that. But there will be some substantial favorites, probably more so in the second and third legs of the sequence. So we'll get there in a little bit, but let's kick things off, Craig, with that first stakes race as part of this Saturday Pick 5, the King Cotton. And as we tee up this first race, I should mention, I was just looking at the forecast for Hot Springs on Saturday, and it does seem like there's a pretty good chance there's going to be a wet track. There was rain predicted throughout the day, starting basically late morning on Saturday all the way through into the evening and into Sunday. So definite wet track on Sunday at Oaklawn, it seems, and probably one on Saturday, and maybe getting worse throughout the day. So I think that's something to be aware of. Not that there are wet track specialists like there were back in the old days when horses used to run a lot more often, but I think you do just want to keep that in the back of your mind as you go through these races because a lot of them haven't tried it before, and it can just add an extra element of chaos to races that might otherwise look a little bit straightforward. So with that, Craig, let's begin diving into this King Cotton. And there is a strong favorite on the morning line in the number 8 Skelly. And when I first was going through this race, I was a little surprised to see him such a clear-cut favorite in this race. And then I pulled up the TimeformUS pace projector, and I kind of understand looking through it. While there is other speed in this field and other horses that want to be forwardly placed, a couple of them are also going out for the Steve Asmussen barn. He actually has 3 in here, and it does feel like breaking from the outside post with that gate speed that we know he possesses. Skelly's going to have a chance to get clear and potentially set a comfortable pace for him.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. There are horses in here who I think could beat him on their best day, but the pace projector really stands out. We don't see many sprint races where horses are shown gapped back to the next horses in the field. And those 2 horses just happen to be trained by Steve Asmussen as well. One's being ridden by his son. And it's really hard to imagine any kind of speed duel developing. When you drop back to the 4th horse on the pace projector, it's a 5 edge to edge. A horse with good tactical speed. He has won races wire to wire, but those were in races where the pace was slow. We have blue fractions in TimeformUS, so it's hard for me to envision them taking him out of his running style. I wanted to be against Skelly here, or at least have some alternatives, and I wouldn't use him as a single. I would pick a few others, but I think he's going to be really hard to beat given that tactical advantage.
Yeah, I mean, Craig, I agree with all of that. I think he probably does have a good trip coming to him in this race, and drawing the outside post is arguably the best place to be for a horse like this, who really just needs that critical clean break. And as long as he gets out to his typical position on the front end, he does figure to be tough because, I mean, this horse, I mean, he just seems to keep going once he gets out to those clear leads, which he doesn't seem to have much trouble attaining in his races. He's seeking his 7th victory in a row at this point. I mean, he's just been on a roll, and it seemed like he picked up right where he left off, coming back off the layoff last time. I will say that allowance race that he won off the layoff, he did get to control through slow fractions. You see just all blue color coded pace figures in TimeformUS for that race. And edge to edge really did take a run at him that day and just could not overcome the pace advantage that Skelly had. I do think Skelly might need to take a slight step forward here because I don't know about you, Craig. I don't know if I necessarily think that he is 100% without a doubt the best horse in this race, because Tejano Twist has been in awesome form lately. He just seems to show up every time. He's a little bit more at the mercy of how the pace has developed than Skelly is, but he seems to love Oaklawn Park, and he was really impressive last time, albeit against some weaker competition. But that run that he put in around the far turn and then sustaining that bid through the stretch, Tejano Twist is in great form, and it's not like he's running speed figures that are off what Skelly's been running recently. I guess you just have to say maybe Skelly's going to take a step forward.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like I said, he wouldn't be a single for me because the only thing to me that makes him a horse that is really strong in here is the fact that he does have that big tactical advantage, because speed figure wise, there's others. Skelly has some faster speed figures last year, but that was before a long layoff. His last 2 haven't been as good, and you have to wonder if he can get back to those levels. And you mentioned Tejano Twist. He loves Oaklawn Park. He's razor sharp. His speed figures aren't far off, even edge to edge. He ran fine last time. And another horse I'm interested in who got a big TimeformUS speed figure last time was the 6 Miles Ahead, who did so without benefit of much pace and really finished off his race strong. So despite Skelly's low morning line, it's a horse I would use, but I don't want to lean on him too heavily because I think there's some other horses in here who are every bit as good as him. And sometimes if you make a bet just based on a perceived tactical advantage, it doesn't always play that way on the track.
Yeah, Craig, when I was first looking at this race, I was sort of tempted to just reluctantly end up in the Skelly camp and use him prominently. But the more that I started to dig in, it does feel like it's a pretty tough race, especially for a listed stakes event. I mean, there are some good horses in here, and I'm not convinced that Skelly is necessarily so much better than everybody else. This is a bit of a test for him. And I should say, something we try to do on this podcast, Craig, is just try to poke holes in favorites. Even if we're going to lean on those favorites, just try to see what their vulnerabilities might be. And one thing I noticed that's interesting with Skelly, just kind of, it's sort of a fluke just based on the times at which he's run, but this is going to be his first ever start without Lasix. And I do think that's something you want to be aware of, just given the places that he's run, Texas and Oaklawn, the times at which he's run before these tracks necessarily complied with HISA and are not running with Lasix and stakes races like all of the horses will not be in this stakes race at Oaklawn on Saturday. He'll be coming off Lasix for the first time. And we've already seen horses like, especially Tejano Twist and even Miles Ahead on occasion, run strong races without Lasix. So I just think that's something that maybe you want to be aware of on a horse that I do think is going to be a pretty short price in this race. I think that Tejano Twist, just based on raw talent, is right up there with Skelly. It's a matter of whether or not he's going to get that right kind of pace setup, and I think that's a big question mark. Craig, as far as Miles Ahead, the horse that you brought up, I went into the charts expecting to be able to poke some holes in that speed figure he got for the Thanksgiving Classic last time, and seems legitimate. Super Ocho came back with a win in decent time. I know Kavod came back at his next race and didn't run well, but I think his next dirt sprint, he won in an upset at Fairgrounds against a good field. I mean, that speed figure is basically held up to scrutiny. And I know Tejano Twist beat him easily, I think, 3 times when they met at Oaklawn and Churchill last year and then into the fall of last year. But Miles Ahead maybe took a step forward in that most recent start. He could just be thriving right now. So I think he's interesting. And probably it's too much of a reach, Craig, and I would not make him my top pick in this race. I just want to mention him. But watching back that Ring the Bell Stakes that Tejano Twist won in such convincing fashion last time, I had liked Osborne going into that race, and I maintained that Osborne did not get the best rider trip in that race. He tried to get forward, but the inside post kind of worked against him, got shuffled back around the far turn, and he was running on once he finally found daylight at the end. The problem is, I just wonder if this is too tough a spot for him. I think he's better than his last race, and I think the outside post, with these blinkers being added, are going to allow him to be much more forward than he's been in some other starts going back to the middle of last year. I just wonder if he's more of an underneath type to use in exactas and trifectas as opposed to a horse that I really want to key on in the pick 5 sequence.
That's how I view him. And it's not that I don't think he'll run a better race. I do. It's just that the competition is so much stronger in this race, in my opinion. He is the last horse to beat Skelly, I believe, when he beat him in an Oaklawn Park allowance race the last time I think they may have probably the last time they faced off, but he just hasn't really run the speed figures. But I could definitely see some improvement. He's going to need to be closer up, but at the end of the day, I think this is a tougher race than it really looked at first glance, particularly at the pace projector. And like we said, maybe Skelly will just be too good early and run off and get everything his way. But at what's going to be a short price, I don't want to have my whole ticket riding on Skelly.
Yeah, the one horse that could potentially be a thorn in the side of Skelly that is not maybe captured as accurate as he could be on the pace projector, just based on the way that we put the pace projector together, is the number 2 Excess Magic, because he looked like a completely different horse last time, showing much better speed than he had in any of his prior starts. He had sort of been a closing sprinter on the turf, and in that off the turf race, they decided to be really aggressive with him. That's something that Louis Saez is great at doing, and they send him to the front, and he just widened throughout. I don't think he's as fast as Skelly. I don't think he's good enough, but I just wanted to mention him as a horse that could potentially have intentions to go forward in this race. Whereas I think that you're right. Some of those other horses trained by Steve Asmussen, Rivet and Jackson Traveler, they're probably going to be content to take up a stalking position. And I think that there'll at least be an attempt made by the rider of Excess Magic, or Rafael Hermano, to get him forward like he was last time. I don't think he's going to be able to get in front of Skelly, but just wanted to mention that potential scenario.
Yeah, for sure. And that's just one of those things. I mean, you can't capture everything in a pace projector. He changed Barnes last time, and he's changing Barnes again. But on that Barnes switch to the Eddie Keneally barn, he really showed more early speed than he ever had before. And it was successful. So you would think that the new connections would want to try to emulate that in this spot.
And just to make it clear, because I talked my way all around different opinions, I would probably lean towards Tejano Twist and Skelly as dual A's in this race, with maybe Miles Ahead as a B and Osborne as a C. That's kind of how I'm thinking about it right now. But it's a tough leg of this sequence because there is an inclination to try to really narrow this down because we know these horses well, and it feels like one of the smaller fields that is a little more straightforward. But as you said, the more that you dig into it, it feels like there are a few potential outcomes, whereas it might look a little bit clearer when you're just taking into account that pace projector.
Yeah, and I mean, my last thing on this race, sure, Skelly looked good in the return, but it was a very easy race where he was never challenged. He was gone over 6 months. I believe there was an injury, and you just never know if they're going to be the same horse. And I don't think that comeback race is something that you could guarantee he's the same horse as before he went away.
Yeah, he didn't knock my socks off that day, Craig. He ran fine, and his final time numbers have been pretty consistent, but I just don't want to lean too hard on him at what I do think is going to be a pretty short price in here. Let's move on to the next leg of this sequence, race 9. It is the Martha Washington for the 3-year-old fillies going the mile and a 16th distance. And I think we're going to have another strong favorite in this race, Craig, and that is the number 8, Denim and Pearls. She's 6-5 on the morning line, and I could see her going off at a price that's pretty similar to that. I think a key factor in this race is that the horse that beat her last time in the year's end, Ice Cold, is not back in this spot. And really, there's nobody else in here that's running quite as fast as Denim and Pearls on the way in. And I don't love the fact that she lost at a short price last time, especially going out for the Brad Cox bar. These horses tend to win when they are short prices in races like this, but she had shown talent prior to that when she won that optional claimer at Churchill Downs. I think we'd even talked about that race on the Pacecast. She was impressive that day. And watching back that race where she was beaten by Ice Cold at Oaklawn last time, it did feel like maybe Denim and Pearls lost a little bit of focus when she made the lead coming off the far turn. It seemed like she was going to win that race, and then she just got to shortening stride a little bit, and it felt like once Ice Cold ranged up alongside of her, Denim and Pearls actually kicked on again and maintained that half to 3/4 of a length margin right on through the wire and was trying to come back on her after the wire. It was that short stretch run. So I feel like just based on raw talent, Denim and Pearls is probably the best horse. It's just a matter of how short a price you want to take and if there's anybody else in here that you think might be value.
This is a race that I'm probably going to lean on the favorite a bit more than any of the others. I don't really have any knocks on her. I think there's a very good argument that the Martha Washington on Saturday was not as strong a race as what we saw last time in the year's end. I mean, that race was a month ago. The TimeformUS race rating was a 103. These horses should be getting faster. Now, granted, very few of them would have even run in the interim, but it just seems like a weaker spot. It didn't draw much of a field in here. The second choice is a horse who was third in that same race, easily beaten by the favorite Denim and Pearls. So for me, I'm going to put most of my stock into Denim and Pearls, but there is one other horse I want to use, and probably unsurprisingly, it's the other Brad Cox horse, who I think has the most upside of all the other horses we've seen. I liked what I saw when she broke her maiden, when stretched out to 2 turns. Her speed figure's not too far off of the other one. So when I said I'm going to lean on Denim and Pearls, I probably should say I'm going to lean on these two, because if there's one horse I think could upset her, I think it's her stablemate.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like Denim and Pearls is running speed figures that are so much faster than everybody else that you would be, knocked off your chair if somebody else moved up 5-8 points and beat her in this race. I think that's kind of the story of this 3-year-old filly division. I mean, Denim and Pearls with her paired up 104 TimeformUS speed figures is kind of running as fast as the horse that was the champion in this division last year. So it seems very open right now. So I don't want to, go overboard saying that one horse is necessarily so much better than everybody else. And In Good Taste did run a decent speed figure last time. Her final time number was actually higher than the last race of Denim and Pearls. Got knocked down a little bit because In Good Taste did get a very good trip, tracking right in behind a slow pace. And I thought that the rider, Martin Schwann, made a really good move down the backstretch, a savvy move to get her into the lead before they got to the far turn. And she really dug in when she was challenged by that horse, Honor Cat. Now, Honor Cat, the horse that was within ahead of her that day, she was 50-1 on that occasion, coming out of races that didn't make her competitive at all with that field. But does seem like a horse that just suddenly really improved a lot for the Robertina Diodoro barn. I actually think that she was going out for the assistant that day, but subsequently came back and did win for Robertino Diodoro. So maybe that race is more legitimate than it looked at the time, with that 50-1 shot really making her work for it. They did finish 10 lengths ahead of the rest of the field. She's okay. I don't have a big argument against her. I think that Denman Pearls is a much more likely winner. But if In Good Taste is indeed around that 8-1, I don't think that's a bad price on her. And as you start to go through the rest of the field, I find it tough to make cases for a lot of horses, Greg. I agree with you about Neon Beach. I don't really see anything in the last race that would make me think she's going to turn the tables on Denman Pearls. If anything, I think more distance works more in the favor of Denman Pearls than it does for Neon Beach, who I believe is more of a sprinter based on watching her races. Robertina Diodoro does have one in here in the number 5, Promise Me an Empire, and she improved last time when she won that maiden race at Churchill, going the 1-turn mile. I don't love that she was winning or running in those auction restricted races. I feel like those are a little bit weaker, though she did face a nice horse in Shimmering Allure 3-back. That one has since come back to win a stakes in New York and finished second in the Demoiselle. But last time out, when I looked up that field on November 26th, I just wished that I saw a little bit more of substance in that race, what was finishing behind her. So I do think it's a big jump up in class. I am interested in another horse here, Craig, which would be sort of my other one to use along with Denman Pearls, and that's the number 6, Saratoga Secret. I don't know if she's going to be the 15-1 that she is in the morning line. That seems a little too generous to me, but going all the way back to the beginning of her career, she had some talent or showed precocity early on, winning that maiden race on debut at Ellis, and then finishing second in the Schuylerville. I know the Schuylerville was not among the better stakes races that we saw in that 2-year-old filly division last year, but at least she showed some ability back then. And she came back in the fall, and I guess both races looked somewhat disappointing at first glance, but she got almost eliminated at the start of that Fern Creek 2-back at Churchill, was just steadied multiple times all the way to the back of the pack, and actually did pretty well to make a big wide run around the field, getting up for 4th. And then last time, I didn't think she got nearly as good a trip as Divine Gal did when she was finishing 4th in that optional claimer. She sort of had to rally between horses through kickback and traffic, angling down to the rail at the end. It was just not the most comfortable trip. And now she's stretching out for the first time, and she's a horse that I just, especially based on pedigree, always wanted to see go longer. She's by Arrogate, who is turning out to be an excellent dirt route influence. He's connecting with 21% of his dirt route starters. And on the dam side, this dam, who is a aptly named sister, is a half sister to some good horses, including Lookin' at Lee, who was second in the Kentucky Derby, Blended Citizen, who won the Peter Pan Stakes. I mean, that is just all dirt route pedigree on top and bottom, and she's finally getting to go longer, and she has foundation underneath her. So I could see her taking a big step forward going this longer distance.
I'm glad you brought her up. I wanted to ask you about her because she had that break of about 4 months off after the Schuylerville. And since she's come back, she was a horse in her first 2 starts who had plenty of early speed. And now she's come back, and though she's run okay, she's basically had none whatsoever. And my question was going to be, do you think that's by design in anticipation of stretching out? Because I was pretty torn on her. Given her breeding, it certainly seems like one who could jump up. And you mentioned the Schuylerville. I mean, she ran a 94 that day as a early July 2-year-old. Now she comes back in February. I mean, if she's ready to go, there's no reason she couldn't run a triple-digit speed figure.
Yeah, the change in running style is interesting, Craig. I think it's largely a function of the fact that she caught a fast pace last time and then just had so much trouble at the start 2-back. And sometimes horses can feel the after effects of those traumatic starts. And maybe that was a little bit of her last time, hesitating once again, though she didn't break nearly as slowly last time as she did in the race prior, where it wasn't all her own doing. I mean, she got bumped out of position. Going the longer distance, I'm not going to be surprised if she's much more forwardly placed than she was in those last 2 races. And I do think the distance is going to work for her. So she's definitely one that I want to upgrade based on that. And there's nobody else I really want to talk about, Craig. I mean, there are some horses towards the inside that have, won some races or run a couple decent speed figures on occasion, but they just did not do a whole lot for me.
No, the only horse I wanted to mention, just because I'm the guy that makes the speed figures, and I do make all the Oaklawn speed figures. The 7-horse Hush and Honey is a filly who ran 101 last time. It was kind of a jump up, but she's just not for me. She's been running in all cheaper races, broke her maiden and a maiden claimer, been running in those starter allowance races. Plus, she goes longer. The one time she tried long, she was just backing up through the stretch. So I just like to mention those horses if people ever wonder why I ignore a horse whose speed figures look pretty good in this field. But for me, it's, and not even so much that she's been racing in cheaper races, it's that I didn't like her race around 2 turns at Churchill and don't think it really fits here.
Yeah, Hush It Honey is cross-entered on Friday at Oaklawn. She's stuck on the also eligible list, so she might not get in that race, but that race that she's entered in is a 6 furlong allowance race. So it seems like the connections aren't exactly committed to going longer with her. Let's move on to race 10. It is the American Beauty Stakes. This one going 6 furlongs, same distance as the King Cotton, but this one for the older fillies and mares. And Craig, we're going to have a heavy favorite in this race in all likelihood in the number 4 Alva Star. I mean, she is just a total standout on speed figures and class lines. I mean, running one of the best races that we saw from any 3-year-old filly going any distance last year when she put on that show with Vava and the Raven Run to close out her season. And it's not like that came out of nowhere. She was super impressive winning the Prioress in her start just prior to that. I mean, pairing up numbers of 123 and 126. I mean, she was one of the fastest 3-year-old fillies anywhere in the country last year. And now she's making her debut as a 4-year-old. You know, I get being a little skeptical of taking a short price on a horse coming off a layoff, but it does kind of feel like she's finding the right field here.
Yeah, it's going to be tough to beat this filly. She was a horse, like you said, she was very, very good last year. Once she started at Delaware, won that stakes race with a big number, took it to Saratoga, destroyed the Prioress, and there were some pretty good horses in that race. Epic showdown with Vava. I've got no issues with her whatsoever. Maybe some people are a little skeptical about the layoff, but I mean, where else were they going to go? It was too late to run in the Breeders' Cup after the Keeneland race, and there wasn't a whole lot more. I guess she could have went to Santa Anita for that 3-year-old filly race, but it's not like she missed much time. She was right back on the work tab at the end of November. She's been working up a storm ever since, and just seems like a very, very tough horse to beat. If she shows up at 90%, it's hard to imagine her losing this race.
Yeah, Craig, I guess the one potential vulnerability with her is that there is other speed in this race. You got one right to her outside in High Class who kind of has proven she runs her best races when she goes forward. And you've got to imagine Joel Rosario is going to be aggressive with her. You've got the number 7, Miss Arlington, who is pretty quick on occasion. She sometimes takes up a stalking position, but she's got a lot of early speed when you look at some of her early pace figures. So I don't love that Alva Star is drawn inside of those two. If either one of those gets really intent on going to the front, Alva Star has run all of her big speed figures from the front end. So you wonder what would happen if she has to stalk a little bit. I know she did it very early in her career before she really kind of picked things up and turned into the horse that is now making her such a favorite in this race. So that's my one concern with her, that there is other speed in here and she's going to have to deal with a potentially fast pace coming off the layoff. But just based on form and class, I mean, she is a cut above the rest.
Yeah, my inclination would be to single. If I was going to use a backup, it wouldn't be any of those other speed horses. I would look to closers. The one that maybe caught my eye is Royal Spa, who's drawn on the outside. Her speed figures are so far behind, but she ran fine in the La Brea, the race I was talking about before, over what was very possibly a speed favoring track. If there was one horse that was going to pick up the pieces, I would probably trust her the most, but it's just such a big gap to the speed in the speed figures that I would think most of my play is going to go through Alva Star, if not all.
Yeah, Alva Star is definitely an A for me. There is one other horse I want to upgrade just from a value standpoint, and I too was trying to make the case for Royal Spa, Craig, and I couldn't make her fast enough. I mean, she's got the right kind of running style for this race, but for me, she just hasn't really shown up when it matters. And she got such a good trip when she won that allowance race at Churchill 2 back. And it's not like that came up particularly fast race. And, you know, I know she finished 4th in a grade 1 last time, but we've talked about it. That La Brea was no real grade 1 race. It didn't have a field of that quality. And frankly, when I went back and watched it, Craig, I was kind of disappointed. I felt like she at least should have been 3rd in there, the way that the race set up for her. She just didn't really make up any ground through the stretch. And I don't love that they're putting blinkers on now. It just it feels like a move of desperation. She's not a horse that has shown character flaws during her race that would make you think that she's necessarily going to benefit from blinkers. It just seems like the connections want to get something more out of her, so they're putting the blinkers on here. To me, if she's going to be kind of where people go as the closer in this race, I didn't want to go with her. And as I was trying to make the case for somebody to come from off the pace, my eyes kind of wandered to the horse just to her inside, the number 8 Condensation. And I have an easier time making a case for her. I don't know if she'll be 20-1 compared to Royal Spa's 9-2. I think that they're supposed to be more like 6 and 10-1 in this race, respectively. But Condensation, she ran a big race 4 back at Churchill Downs, and that was an allowance race that came up faster than the one that Royal Spa won. The Condensation September allowance compared to Royal Spa's November allowance are the 2 races that I'm talking about. And Condensation did it from off the pace that day, closing into a fast pace. And since then, she went to sprint on the turf, probably not the right configuration for her. Watching back that race in Mahoning Valley 2 back, it's not as bad as it looks when you pull up the replay. She was kind of in heavy kickback around the far turn, not really able to move forward until Rafael Bejarano finally got her into the clear at about the 3/16 pole, and she was finishing decently at the end that day behind Jersey Pearl, who at one time was a good horse. I mean, back at some point earlier in the year, Jersey Pearl gave Alva Star everything that she could handle in a stakes race back at Ellis. And Condensation last time, she tried the turf again, going a little longer at Fairgrounds, and ran a nice race at a big price behind Tufani, who seemed like she was in great form at Fairgrounds at that time. And I know Condensation's form is a little up and down, and it's switching between turf and dirt, but her ceiling is about as high as anybody else in this race except for Alva Star. And I go all the way back to the Honeybee last year. I think I actually liked her a little bit in that race when she was 21-1, and she ran one of the best races of her career in the slop at Oaklawn, and she might get very similar conditions on Saturday. So if there's anybody that I want to upgrade due to value and maybe use on the same tier or a tier just below Alva Star in my play, it would be the number 8 Condensation.
Yeah, you make some very good points about her, and I like Condensation on a sloppy track. That's kind of funny. But yeah, no argument for me. I like you, don't think she'll be 20-1, but she's going to be a price. I would be more interested in her in verticals, and you've probably changed my mind as to who would be my backup if I even use one.
Yeah, because I agree with you. It's hard to see horses like High Class and Miss Arlington winning this race with Alva Star in there. If somebody survives the pace, it's much more likely to be Alva Star, and we'll see if coming off the layoff it softens her up at all. But I think that if you're trying to beat her, Craig, it's just a value-based thing, because what price is she going to be in here? 2-5, 3-5? I think she's probably supposed to be odds on in here. It's just whether you think the layoff at a potential wet track adds enough uncertainty that maybe she's not great value in a pick 5 sequence, because typically these kinds of horses in a pick 5 like this, where there are some legs that look particularly wide open, she sort of becomes the universal single, and maybe she's 3-5 to win the race on the tote board, but she could be 1-5 in terms of people using her in the pick 5 sequence. So beating horses like this just inject a ton of value into these sequences, but you can't just, fire random bullets hoping to beat favorites like this. You've got to make the reasoned case. And I can get there with maybe one other horse in this race, but I'm definitely not spreading to beat this favorite.
Yeah, one interesting side note before we move on is Alva Star seems to have gotten really, really good since she came off of Lasix when moving in the stakes races. So it's not a concern with her at all.
That's a good point, Craig. I mean, it's not a negative for every horse. Some horses seem to run well without Lasix. It's really an individual thing. And I think, some people take horses coming off Lasix as a universal negative. It isn't necessarily that. And also one other thing to point out about Alva Star, just kind of with the way that the allowance conditions of this race work out, she's actually getting weight from most of the field. I don't know exactly how the conditions of this race are written. Maybe it has to do with what horses have accomplished in 2024, but for some reason, she gets in at 117 pounds and most of her main rivals are carrying 122. So just something to note about a horse who probably doesn't need more help to beat this field. Let's move on to the feature race in this sequence. Race 11 is the Grade 3 Southwest. This one, a Derby prep, really the lead up to the major races on the Oaklawn Trail to the Kentucky Derby, that being the Rebel Stakes, and a couple months down the line, the Arkansas Derby. So we'll see if any of these 3-year-olds can get onto that path, Craig. 20 qualifying points on the line for the winner of this race. A big purse put up, $800,000, and it has attracted a large field of 12 runners. And as the last last reporting that I saw, it does feel like this race is supposed to stay intact, because even Awesome Road, who's cross-entered a Turfway, our colleague Mary Rampolini reported that he is going to run here despite the wide post position that he drew. So it seems like we're going to have a large field, Craig, and it's a competitive race. I'm not really sure where you're supposed to begin in here. I guess we could go sort of with the horses that are short prices on the morning line, and you probably do have to develop some kind of opinion about the horse that was made the morning line favorite. I don't think this horse is going to be the favorite when all is said and done, but the number one, Maycock's Bay, you kind of have to decide if you think that 116 TimeformUS speed figure is legitimate or not, because if it's not, it really opens this race up. If it is legitimate, he's going to win.
Yeah, he ran huge last time. I know we talked about this race on the Pacecast after it happened, and unfortunately, it's a race that was a field of 6 run back in the early January. Not a single horse has run back, which isn't all that uncommon these days. But personally, I think the figure was legitimate. Watching the race, everything I liked visually, he looked good. I mean, it's not like it was the only route race on the card. There were a couple others, if memory serves, at the same exact distance. And he just seemed like a horse that figured something out. Now, the negative is he did so adding Lasix for the first time, which he does not get here. So I'm kind of torn on him. He's a horse I would use, but I wouldn't want to bank on him being able to repeat that speed figure on Saturday just because of the Lasix issue.
Yeah, for me, there are two major issues with him. One is the Lasix issue, as you highlighted. That's just some uncertainty with a horse that had not run a race like that without Lasix in his 4 prior starts. My big concern with him, Craig, and I think that'll segue into the next major discussion point in this race, is the way that the pace is going to shake out, because he's drawn the inside. They almost have to be aggressive with him. And I'm not even sure that he's quick enough to get to the lead, because there are some really fast horses drawn to the outside. And if Maycock's Bay doesn't get to the front, I really worry about his trip, because I've watched his last 2 races, and I think it's almost more important to watch his race 2 back than it is the big victory last time, because his race 2 back, his first time stretching out, he did not make the lead that day. They tried to rate him, and he got very rank and keen in behind horses and just did not seem settled for basically the first half mile of that race. And then he had nothing left for the finish, and he settled much better last time. He was still a little keen, but he settled better when they were able to make the lead with him, set his own fractions, and then spurred away at the end. And I worry if maybe he's just a need the lead type, because really in the races where he's had to take kickback or race behind horses, he's done absolutely nothing. And in the races where he's been able to be out free running in the clear is when he's had success. And I just don't know if he's going to get that kind of trip this time, Craig. So I'm inclined to just kind of toss him in this spot. I don't think he's going to be 3-1. Maybe he's 5-1 in this race, but he's not for me just based on those 2 points. And as for the pace, does feel like some of those horses drawn towards the outside have to be aggressively ridden.
And there's some pretty fast horses in here. I mean, even not before we get to the far outside. Carbone is a horse who's went wire to wire in both starts easily for Steve Asmussen. He seems like he's going to need to show some speed. The horse we have shown on the front, Mystic Dan, he was out there winging it in the Smarty Jones. Actually, I should say chasing, but it was a very quick pace that day. He was right there before kind of dropping anchor in the last furlong. The 11 horse Just Steel, he's a horse who's shown plenty of sprint speed in his career. Both times he's went long, he's been up close. And, you know, I mentioned that Smarty Jones, even though the fractions aren't coded in red, that was a very fast race early. It was just a matter that it finished pretty good with Catching Freedom, getting a good final time figure that kept that race from having red fractions. But if you just watch the race, it definitely had that fast pace kind of flow to it.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, Craig. How do you think they're going to bet this race? Because I found it difficult to really get a handle on who was going to be short prices. And I think it's important to talk about, because there are so many ways for them to go. I was kind of thinking that maybe Carbone would be the favorite, just based on those 2 blowout victories and a lightly raced horse with such obvious upside for Steve Asmussen. But I mean, with Bob Baffert in the race, and Steve Asmussen having another one with form, I mean, there are a lot of horses that could potentially take money in here.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if the favorite is 3-1 or maybe even 7-2 in a race like this. If I had to guess who the favorite's going to be, I would go with Winstock just because it's Bob Baffert and he does so well when he ships to Oaklawn, and he's coming off a win in a grade 2 at a big price, albeit, but he's getting better every time speed figure wise. I don't particularly love him in this spot as a horse who's done all his best running on the front end, but like I said, it could go a lot of ways, but he's the horse that I would probably say is a 40% chance to be the favorites, and maybe there's some others in the 20% range.
Yeah, I mean, normally I would agree with that. I wonder what the impact will be of Kyle Frey riding this horse as opposed to some of the usual jockeys that Bob Baffert puts on the back of his top Derby prospects. I mean, I think Kyle Frey riding this horse is a big part of Winstock being 13-1 the last couple of times, when typically we don't see Bob Baffert horses that win go off at those prices. So, I mean, something to consider. I mean, as for these horses that figure to vie for favoritism, Craig, I don't know if any of them are going to be great value. I think the Carbone might be a pretty talented horse. It's just going to be a very different kind of trip that he's gotten his last couple of races, where he really hasn't had to deal with that much pace pressure. He's gotten to set slow to comfortable paces, and it feels like this time he's either going to have to rate or they're going to have to be really aggressive with him to set a faster pace than he has in recent starts. So I think there's real talent there. I just wouldn't want to take any kind of short price on him given the kind of trip that I think he's going to get. Winstock, I thought he also has gotten very good trips in softer pace situations when he's won, especially last time, that Los Alamitos Futurity. And I guess the horse that overcame a tougher pace is Otto the Conqueror, Craig, but gosh, that Springboard Mile, they just walked home that day. It was not a slow final time. I know that it got a big pace upgrade, but even the race 2 back when he ran a decent speed figure and was a little more convincing visually, he got to set a slower pace, and it was in the slop, and at least he's handled some wet tracks. But Otto the Conqueror, I just don't know if he's quite this good.
No, I hate to say it, as Remington's kind of my home track, but I think that race was really weak. You can see it in the TimeformUS race rating. Granted, it was a month and a half ago, but it's only a 96, whereas we're predicting a 111 for the Southwest. So he's not for me. I'll jump into the horses that I do like, and it is focused on the pace that we've kind of harped on here. I can envision this race being a meltdown where it just gets way too hot up front. Now, I do think you're going to have to have some tactical speed, given it's a race where they use the alternate finish line. They'll, I think, oh no, mile on the 16th, they won't. I was thinking of the Southwest, so even better. The horses I want to key on in here, I'll start with the 8-horse Common Defense. It's Ken McPeak horse, is definitely going to be coming from off the pace, has some good tactical speed. I liked what I saw in his maiden win at that short finish line race. When he broke his maiden, he blew the field away in the lane, and it just seems like he's going to get a good trip. And the other horse I'm interested in, and these will be my 2 A's, is the horse you mentioned that is going to run, who may have been going the Turfway, and that's Awesome Road. He was a horse that ran a huge maiden win at Ellis Park, and I know sometimes what happens at Ellis Park stays at Ellis Park. Things went wrong in 2 very good races, the Breeders' Futurity and the Kentucky Jockey Club. He just, for whatever reason, I don't think he got great trips those days, but he just didn't really have it. But he's a horse who I think has some real talent. You can just look at the odds he was in those races. Normally, I wouldn't like the 12 post, but given the way that I think this race is going to develop, I think he'll be able to be 2, at worst 3 wide on the first turn. And I'm looking for a reversal from him. I don't think it's an accident that Brad Cox entered him here as his only horse. He's a guy that's got a ton of horses who he could have run in this spot. And I'm just expecting a big rebound on a horse that may get overlooked.
Yeah, I really don't know exactly what to do with Awesome Road, Craig, and I'm inclined to be against him in here. He was entered in that Lecomte Stakes a couple of weeks ago at Fairgrounds and scratched out of there. It was advertised well ahead of time he was going to scratch. So, I mean, I don't know if there was an issue or if they just wanted to point to this race instead. They probably didn't love drawing this far outside post position, but they're going to go ahead with it. I mean, it makes sense to run here. It's such a big purse, and it's a wide open race. I know he's got that LP flag on the pace projector indicating that he's got the highest TimeformUS late pace rating. Looking at his form, I can't quite figure out where that's coming from, because to my eye, watching replays, this horse has really lacked finish in his last couple of starts going longer. And I don't know if it's I mean, I didn't love the trip last time because he did make an early move on the backstretch going wide, but he came around the turn of that Kentucky Jockey Club like he was going to win the race. He hadn't been asked yet by Flavien Prat, was ranging up like he looked like he was 6-5 at the quarter pole. And then just all of a sudden, he's out of horse and he's stopping and he's going backwards. And he just completely shut down at the end of that race. And I know it was a tough field too back in the Breeders' Futurity, but kind of the same thing. I mean, he was trying to make a move. It was asked early and just completely empty in the stretch. And this horse was really impressive on debut at Ellis. And I know that race got a big speed figure. I wonder where that horse has been since then. And it makes me wonder if maybe dirt routes are not the answer for this horse. And they've got to run in these races. I mean, he was an expensive horse. You've got to try the Derby Trail, but I have a strong sense that this is not what this horse is meant for. Maybe he wants to go shorter based on the debut. Maybe he's a closing sprinter or just a dirt sprinter in general. I tend to think this is a horse that we might eventually see on the turf. There's turf on the bottom side. Watching him run, I could see him transitioning to the turf. And watching those last two races, Craig, I can't like him in here. I can't like horses that don't finish the races, and he's just stopped in his last two races. So he's not for me in here. I agree with you about the number 8 Common Defense. He's one that I'm very interested in as well. There are 3 horses I like in here, and he's one of them. I don't know if he beat much last time in that maiden race at Oaklawn, but visually, I liked the way that he did it. He showed a lot of professionalism, waiting behind horses, angling out, and then accelerating to unleash that finish. And that was the short stretch going the 1 mile distance. And what I really liked was watching the gallop out. He continued to put distance between himself and the rest of the field. And he's got a ton of stamina breeding on the bottom side. He's his second dam is Alchemist, who's been a good stamina influence. He's actually related to Fearless, who was not a half brother, but his dam's a half to the dam of Fearless, who was that winner of the Brooklyn going 1.5 miles. I mean, this horse is supposed to really like some added distance, and I know it's only 1 1/16 here, but I think there's talent with this horse. And also, I like when Ken McPeak comes back off a maiden win and immediately steps horses into stakes races. We've seen him have success with that move. I looked it up in Formulator, and the win percentage is, I think, only 18% in a 38 horse sample. But given how difficult that is to go from a maiden win into a stakes race, 18% is actually pretty good. And the ROI is very healthy. I think it's above $3. So Common Defense is one that I definitely want to use. I think the logical closer in the race is the number 6, Liberal Arts. To me, he just makes a ton of sense in here. I kind of view him as the horse to beat, even though he's never run a triple-digit TimeformUS speed figure before. Given how lightly raced these horses are and the trajectory that this one's on, I don't care so much that he hasn't run as fast as some other horses. I just really like the visual of his races. 2 back at Churchill. On paper or looking out on screen, as our former boss, Mark Attenberg, I can hear him in my ear wanting us to say on screen, not on paper. He used to harp on me for using that phrase because obviously TimeformUS is mostly a digital product. But looking on screen at Liberal Arts' past performances, you might be inclined to say that he disappointed 2 back in that Iroquois Stakes where he got a fast pace to close into and couldn't get the job done. But when you go back and watch that replay, Craig, it's not so apparent just given the written trouble line, but he did not get a good ride that day. I mean, he was ridden into traffic at the quarter pole, had to alter course multiple times in the stretch, lost momentum at the 8th pole, and was still coming on at the end and finishing stronger than anybody else across the wire. I think if the rider hadn't gotten cute and just wheeled him to the outside, he would have won that day. And then last time out, I mean, there were some tired horses finishing off that street sense, except for him. He was the only horse that was running through the line with vigor. And he just feels like one that's been getting better and better with more distance and more experience. And it shouldn't be a surprise. He's by Arrogate, and that's been the pattern of all of the Arrogates that we've seen so far, or most of them. I just think he fits this race like a glove. I don't know if Liberal Arts is going to be 8-1 because I kind of think he's a little more obvious than that, even though the speed figures are a little depressed. But I think he makes a lot of sense. And I've got one more horse to talk about, Craig, but before to give myself a rest and a drink of water, I'll let you respond to some of those.
No, I mean, we agree on Common Defense. And Liberal Arts, I've got no issue. I have him as my backup in here. The speed figures, maybe a little concerning, but we haven't seen this horse since October as a 2-year-old. We're talking, 3 months since then. could easily project up to that 110 TimeformUS speed figure or TimeformUS race rating that we see for this race. And yeah, he's a horse who, particularly given the way the pace is going to develop, I think he's got a shot. And I just think this is a race that could get very interesting late. Before we move on, I just want to mention that there's a couple. Just Steel's probably going to take for some money. I want to mention he's not for me. He comes in for D. Wayne Lucas. He's a horse that I've just always thought is going to be better sprinting. Some might get a little fooled by his Smarty Jones. Even though the pace was quick and he was up there, it seemed like a race where just everybody was struggling late other than the winner catching Freedom. And I'm not interested in him or Mystic Dan, another horse who ran okay in that Smarty Jones.
Yeah, I kind of meant to get your take on that, Craig, because that Smarty Jones did, I mean, it came up a fast race. You can't argue with that, but it does feel like that fig's a little high for some of those horses. And even though they look good on paper, Mystic Dan and Just Steel, just looking at the raw speed figures, I agree. They don't really seem like good fits for this race. And I haven't even mentioned the horse that I put on top yet, because I did do a stakes preview for this race yesterday. And I just tried to make some value-based selections in a race that I think is totally wide open. And I put the number 9 linebacker on top, and I don't know if he's certainly not the most likely winner of this race, far from it, but I just think he's an interesting horse to talk about, because when you're comparing the speed figures of the potential closing options, he's one of the fastest horses among them, especially looking at that 105 that he got 2 back in that very fast Legalized race, and we saw Legalized come back and win, so I think that's somewhat legitimized. And some people might be down on him because he lost that most recent race, stretching out to the 2 turns for the first time as the even money favorite. And I think if you're just looking on paper, you might view that as a sign that maybe he's a horse that wants to go shorter. I firmly believe the opposite is true. And I think the trip is what got this horse beat last time. He got off slowly. He was towards the back of the pack, last heading into the clubhouse turn, had to try to advance while in heavy traffic. He was traveling in the bridle strongly, not rank or keen or anything, just obviously willing and waiting to do more coming around the far turn, but was on the inside, just around with a ton of horses around him, nowhere to go. And he finally got into some clear sailing at the top of the stretch. But by that point, the winner, Imperial Gun, who might be pretty good, he's a Steve Asmussen second-time starter in that race, he had already snuck away. Linebacker, I thought, really did some running at the end, though, to separate himself from the rest of the field and chase that rival home. If you look at the fractions in GMAX, he was picking up steam all the way through the stretch on through the wire. He actually ran his final 16th in 6.27 seconds. And I know that Oaklawn has that slightly downhill stretch, but that's still finishing off a mile in the 16th race, especially for a course that wasn't playing that fast that day. So I think based on that visual, Linebacker wants every bit of this mile in the 16th distance. And he's another one that's got plenty of stamina on the dam side. Physically, he's this big, long striding horse with a nice frame on him that looks like he wants to run all day. And I just think he's going to get ignored here, Craig. He's a maiden in this race. He's going out for low profile connections, but connections that have actually done okay at Oaklawn, especially Manny Escovel, who's ridden some live long shots at the meet. And I just think he's a horse that on paper makes plenty of sense, and just due to the high-powered connections that are going to take a lot of money, he probably gets dismissed at somewhere in the 20-1 range.
Yeah, if you think I'm going to argue with you on a 30-1 shot, you've come to the wrong guy. You made some good points. The only thing I'll mention about him is I had no idea who trainer Jordan Blair was when I was handicapping this race, so I did a search, and just wanted to mention there's a pretty good article, a Q&A with him from the Thoroughbred Daily News. If you just Google Jordan Blair trainer, it will come up. And yeah, I learned a little bit, and I certainly would not bet a horse because he's behind the wheels.
Jordan Blair did send out one winner so far this meet at Oaklawn. It was ridden by Manuel Escovel, and it paid $34 coming in from Turfway. So just something to mention on a horse that is probably going to be in a similar price range in this race. It's wide open, Craig, and I think you can make a case for a lot of horses. We've covered almost everybody in the field, but it is that kind of race that it makes it especially difficult to put the pick 5 sequence together, and things are not going to get that much easier as we proceed on to the final leg of this sequence, race 12. It's going the same mile and a 16th distance, so doing you a favor from that standpoint, Craig. You'll have 2 races back-to-back at the same distance to compare, making the speed figures, but as far as handicapping this allowance, a race that closes out the card, it's a tough one. You got a large field signed on, oversubscribed, or actually not oversubscribed, but 12 horses signed on, so a full field. And I don't know exactly where to begin. I mean, I guess you got to have a conversation about the horse that is the favorite on the morning line. And I think he probably will be favored, the number 8, Alexander Helios. Kind of strange to see Safi Joseph shipping in with this horse, given that he's not based at Oaklawn. He's not running a horse in a stakes on this card. I don't know. So usually these kinds of horses that run an allowance races sort of come on the van with somebody else, but it just seems like he sent this horse here for this allowance race. It is a pretty big purse. I mean, it's the bigger purse than a lot of the stakes races in Florida, so I get it. And it just seems like this horse has really turned a corner in his last few starts for Safi.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, he's certainly a contender in this field, but I do think the competition gets a little tougher. So it's not like I just want to hand them the race. I certainly have him on the list of horses that I want to use. But as we've alluded to every time we've talked about Oaklawn, and you did in the intro, these allowance races at Oaklawn Park are no joke. I mean, we'll see many stakes races throughout the year that will be of similar or even lesser quality than what this is for. I think it's a non-winners of just one, right?
Yeah, it's an M1X with a $140,000 purse.
Yeah, it's pretty insane. It's another one where I think you want to look at the pace, because a horse who's drawn, when I was first looking at the PPs, I thought maybe he would be the morning line favorite, and that's Next Revolt, horse who comes in just raging form at Remington Park. He was claimed by Diodoro. Took him a start to get going, but he's won wire to wire with big speed figures. But there's some other speed in here, particularly the horse who's a bit of a long shot and one I don't like, but Machine Gun Man. So I think that would make it a little tougher on him. Alexander Helios seems to be in position to get a really good trip if you believe the pace projector. And I think it's pretty good, because there's a lot of other horses in here who just don't have very much speed. So I could see him working out a good trip, and it is part of why I would definitely be using him on my tickets. But I don't just want to hand the race to him either, because I think there's some others that are interesting.
Yeah, one thing I'll note about Alexander Helios is some people might be confused as to why he's eligible for this race, because he won an M1X allowance race last time at Tampa. Now he's back in another one. But it's some smart placement by the connections, because if you carefully read the conditions of this race, it's not exactly an M1X allowance race. It's a race for horses who have never won $24,000 twice. And since the purses at Tampa are much lower than they are at Oaklawn, he only won $19,000 winning that race last time. So it doesn't count towards this condition. So that's why he gets to run in this condition twice in a row. Actually, probably it's one of the reasons why they're shipping to Oaklawn Park to run here, because it's a race that's available for him with a big purse based on the allowance conditions. So I think he's a contender in this race, Craig. I wouldn't want to take too short a price on him, but he has kind of developed that running style where he allows himself to make his own good trips in that stalking to mid-pack position. So I think he makes sense in this race. And you do have to evaluate these two Robertino Diodoro shippers that are coming in from Remington Park, because they both have solid form. They're almost the same price on the morning line, Next Revolt and the number 7 Cosmo. Actually, Cosmo beat Next Revolt when they faced off back in September. Next Revolt has run a couple times since then, winning easily against weaker competition. I think you want to take note of the layoff with these horses, especially in the case of Cosmo, Craig, because he was based at Oaklawn. You could see in his work tab. And let's remember that there were basically a couple weeks where these trainers couldn't even work their horses over the Oaklawn surface because it was shut down due to the cold temperatures and the freezing. And I think it messed up the training of some horses. And maybe that's not a big factor for the horses that just ran in December and January, but for a horse like Cosmo that's kind of trying to get fit, coming back off a layoff, I mean, you could even see, to make sure that Diodoro could work him, he shipped him to Louisiana Downs for the last workout after about a 3-week gap to make sure he could get that work in. But to me, it's not a great sign with a horse coming off a layoff like Cosmo is, to have that 3-week gap in his workout, to know that there were reasons why he couldn't be training. I just wonder a little bit about that horse's fitness.
Yeah, I much prefer Next Revolt, and a lot of it is the layoff. I agree. There was definitely some mistraining. And when you look up Robertino Diodoro, I didn't write down the formulator stats, but even in Timeform US, you can see it. He's an overall, usually around a 90. I think he's an 89 right now on the overall trainer ratings. When he comes off a layoff, he's only a 63. And it's just something I remember from the past. He is not a guy that generally brings horses off a layoff fully cranked and ready to go. And when you give the break in training, I would much prefer Next Revolt out of his 2 horses. The horse I would probably make my top pick in here, and maybe I'm leaning a little too much on Ken McPeak on this day, is the 11 horse 10 Days Later, because I do think it's a race where some pace is going to develop. He's a horse who runs speed figures as good or better than what we've seen from the horses who figure to be involved in the pace. So it just seems like to me that despite the bad post position, I mean, make no mistakes about it, the 11 is not great, but given his running style and the way I see the race developing, I think 10 Days Later's got a big shot and might get overlooked a little because of that post.
Yeah, he's a deep closer, and he's going to be launching from way back. And he's a horse that I agree. On paper, he looks like he fits this race really well. He's got some of the highest speed figures in the field, and he's got that running style. I'm a little bothered watching some of his recent replays, Craig, that he makes this big run around the far turn, and then he kind of hits the wall and he doesn't finish. And it's a problem in races like the 1-3 back at Churchill, where, yeah, he was beaten by a really good horse in Highland Falls. I don't know exactly where he's gone since then. I think he ran once at Fairgrounds, but that's a well-bred Godolphin horse, who I think we might hear from in Stakes Company at some point. But I mean, he got there and then couldn't finish. The race 2 back, he made this big run to get within range of the leaders. And then he just kind of, he compare his running line to that of the number 6 Elusive Target, who they were kind of moving in tandem. And it looked, watching the replay, like 10 Days Later was going to blow past a fading Elusive Target at the 8th pole. And then 10 Days Later just kind of hit that wall. And he kind of stopped and shortened stride. And Elusive Target actually came back on him as they came onto the finish line. And then last time, it was not the greatest ride from Julien Leparoux. You don't want to go 4 wide around the turns. And he made a bit of a premature move on the backstretch. But I mean, he got there at the top of the stretch, and you would think that a deep closer like him, even in spite of that trip, would have a little more finishing power than some horses drawn towards the inside, who like a Cat Daddy or a Pledge of Allegiance. But 10 Days Later was fading at the end of that race. And I just worry a little bit about his desire to win, or his ability to sustain these moves that you need to do if you're going to make that big run from off the pace in a dirt route. So when I watched his replays, I ended up kind of wanting to not use him at all, as opposed to when I was looking on paper, I was thinking I was going to like him a little more. So I was looking in different directions, Craig, and I agree that this pace could heat up a little bit. I know it's got that fast-paced flag. A large part of that is a function of the 12-horse field. But, I mean, horses like the number 4, Machine Gun Man, they've got to go forward. I think Cat Daddy, based on the way he ran last time at a big price, they're probably going to look to be aggressive with him once again. Next Revolt, as you pointed out, he's got plenty of early speed breaking from the inside. He's got to go. And then you've got that wild card, the number 10, Woodcock Flight, who has never raced on dirt before, but when you watch his European races, he's a front runner. So maybe Nick Warrels will be looking to get forward with him. So I could really see this pace heating up. And I just wanted to look for some different closers. And actually, when I was watching back that last that race 2 back for 10 Days Later, I started to get really interested in the number 6 Elusive Target, because he's going to be a bigger price. He's got a similar running style. And to me, watching his replays, he just has a lot more heart and fight than that Ken McPeak horse does. He looked like he was beaten and tired 2 back. And once Luis Fuentes really got into him, he was actually finding more across the finish line, gaining ground on the horses that were 3rd and 4th that day. Last time out, he was never in the most comfortable position. He was encountering some kickback and traffic at the top of the stretch. In the position that he was in, a lot of horses would have just kind of, stayed on at one pace and settled for 5th or 6th. And he kept battling on, searching for daylight, running on to finish 3rd behind some decent horses, including King Russell, who we know was 2nd in the Arkansas Derby last year. It feels like this horse has taken a subtle step forward since the claim by Matt Schurer, who is obviously a very sharp trainer. And I just think he's drawn a better post position. He's got a good running style for this race, and he's going to be a better price than some other closers I would have considered. So Elusive Target would be the one that I would want to lean on most in this race.
Yeah, I've got no issue. We'll have to do a lunch bet on deep closers and see which one of us comes out on top on this one. The main thing, and you mentioned it and I forgot to, is I like the rider change on 10 days later too. I think it could make a difference, but I've got no argument. Your horse is a bigger price. He could be making the same run, and I just landed on 10 days later, but no problem with him either. If I was going to use one of the speed horses, it would be the one horse Next Revolt, who I think's in very good form and has that inside post position. And, if he's ridden aggressively, which Harry Hernandez is known to do at times, and he's doing fine at Oaklawn, I could see him gunning out of there and taking the lead and being tough to run down. But it's not a race that I'm going to spread as much as I originally thought that I would. I like the one in here a little. I like the 8, and I'll stick with my 11.
Yeah, I'm not really against Next Revolt. Of the two Diodoro horses, like you, I much prefer him to the number 7 Cosmo. With Cosmo, I never like horses that run by far the best race of their careers and then immediately go to the sidelines. To me, that's just a big red flag. And if you say, well, I don't quite trust him to run back the last race, which other races in Cosmo's form would make you want to bet him in here? None of them. I mean, they make him like a 20-1 shot in this race. So he's not for me. And I do think of the Diodoro horses, Next Revolt is just the better horse. I mean, 4 of his last 5 races make him super competitive with this field. And I know he was beating basically nothing in the last couple of races at Remington, but boy, he was visually impressive in those races. And this horse might just be in very good form right now. So I don't want to be too against him just because the pace could heat up a little bit. And I think that mostly covers the horses I like. I'll mention one more, who just seems logical to me, and that's the number 9 Pledge of Allegiance, Craig. I mean, to me, he just ran a little better than 10 days later when they met in that December 29th race. I know 10 days later got that wide trip, but it's not like Pledge of Allegiance was towards the inside that day. And he was really fighting on at the end. He did get a better trip than that horse, but he also has that running style that's probably going to allow him to get a better trip once again. So I'm not against him either. He might be more of a B type for me because he can be a little bit up and down, but he did run one of his better races first off the claim for the Ron Moquette barn. He was going out for once again here. So he just seems like another very logical contender in this spot.
His speed figure fits. My issue, I'm a little more concerned about the trip from him from the 9 post, given all the speed. And he's a horse who's done his best running, not on the lead, but pretty much up close. He's not a horse who launches from the back. He did it a few times in his career early in sprint races, but at 2 turns, he's usually more in a tracking position, and that can be tough from the 9 hole.
Yeah, he's a horse that he's 4 for 33 lifetime. He doesn't win that often, and there are some knocks against him. But if we're talking about horses that have the credentials to win this race, he's kind of right at the top of the list. So we'll see what we get from him in terms of the trip. But not an easy way to close out this sequence by any means, Greg. These last 2 legs are really treacherous, but there's also opportunity there because if you got opinions on long shots, you'll definitely be able to get some value, even if it turns out to be somewhat chalky early on. So for me, Craig, this is a potentially appealing sequence to play if you can make an affordable ticket. And we'll try to lay one out here. I'll let you go first to discuss how you might approach this kind of wager.
Yeah, in that King Cotton, I'm going to resist the urge to just really lean on Skelly because I think it's a pretty open race and he could very well win. I'm not going to toss him out or anything. I would probably make him a co-A, and do it with Tejano Twist, which I think is what you said as well. And then as backups, I would use Miles Ahead and who was the other horse? Edge to Edge, who he just runs the same speed figure every time, and that speed figure fits in here. So I could envision a scenario where he gets a nice trip and could get the job done. So he'd be a backup for me. In the, what is the name of that race? The Martha Washington. I think Denim and Pearls is going to be very, very tough. If I was going to use another horse, it would be the other Brad Cox horse, In Good Taste. I think you made a good case for the horse you like, Saratoga Secret. Just depending how much my ticket cost, I could maybe use her as a backup as well because the stretch out does seem interesting. But most of my play is going to be going through the favorite in that one. And similarly, in the American Beauty, I'm going to lean really heavily on Alva Star. If I was going to use a backup, you changed my mind. Why would I take 9-2 on a horse I don't really like when I could take 20-1 on a horse that, has some merits, just like the 9, but probably isn't going to beat the favorite. But if I was going to use a backup, it would be Condensation. In the Southwest, this one's a little tough. I would probably do a little spreading. My 2 A's, as I mentioned, would be Awesome Road and Common Defense, because I'm kind of expecting a little meltdown in here. Backups, I would consider Maycox Bay, because there's a scenario where he gets to the front, he matches that speed figure, and, maybe he's just good in here. But that's about it. I don't want to go too crazy in this race. I would probably try to find some room for a couple long shots. Like you mentioned, linebacker. I could certainly see using him on the tickets and liberal arts, but it's a race where you go really narrow in the 2 races before. You could spread a little bit here. I think we've given that option. And then in the last leg, it's a pretty wide open race, but I don't want it to go too crazy on it. I would definitely use Next Revolt, who I think could go wire to wire. I like the Ken McPeak horse, 10 Days Later. And who was the other? Oh, and Alexander Helios is the one who just is in good form. And as you mentioned, basically already got through this condition. It's just a function of the purses at Tampa. But that race at Tampa was probably close to this one, maybe not as deep, but there were some good horses in there. So it would mostly be 1, 8, and 11 for me.
And for me, I'm going to try to go pretty, how do I put it? A balance with this ticket. I'm not going to try to spread a lot in those last 2 legs, because I have opinions in there, and I have opinions that are less strong from a value standpoint in the first few legs. So I want to keep my options open. And the King Cotton, even though my first inclination starting to handicap this sequence was to go thin, I kind of want to spread in this race, because I think that Skelly doesn't necessarily have to win, and there are plenty of others that are on a similar ability level. So I'm going to use Tejano Twist, and Skelly probably as the A's. I would definitely have Miles ahead in there as at least a B, if not also an A. And, Craig, Edge to Edge could be a C. I mentioned Osborne as a horse that I could use as a C. So somewhere in different tiers, I'd probably want to use 5 horses in that leg. Again, we're not talking a caveman ticket. I'd want to use some more strongly than others. In the Martha Washington, I could narrow this one down a little bit more. I think Denim and Pearls and Saratoga Secret would be my 2 A's. One of them, obviously, a much better value option, but just reflecting that I'm not really against Denim and Pearls. I just don't think she's going to be any great value from a win standpoint in this sequence. In the American Beauty, I kind of have to decide if I want to use the 8 Condensation as a co-A with Alva Star, if I want Alva Star to be the A and Condensation to be the B. The latter strategy is probably the more prudent one, but Condensation is going to be a big price from a win standpoint. It could really blow up this sequence if she's able to capitalize on that potential pace scenario. So if it seems affordable enough, I would love to have Condensation as an A in that race, and they're really the only 2 that I want in there. In the Southwest, there are a lot of horses that you could use. I really want to narrow this down, though. There are really only 3 horses that I'm interested in betting on, and those are, in no particular order, the number 6 Liberal Arts, the number 8 Common Defense, and the number 9 Linebacker. And I think they're all going to be great value from a win standpoint. So I'd want to use all 3 of them as A's in this race. If I was going to use one other horse as a backup, as a B or a C, I guess it would be Carbone, because I think there's a chance that he just is a special talent. But I don't love the trip or the prospective win value on that horse. So I'm happy to downgrade him and just really focus on those 3 closers that I think are going to be the right prices in the Southwest. And then in the final leg, I could use multiple A's in this race, but the more that I talk about it and think about it, I like the number 6 Elusive Target, and I think he's going to be good value in this race. So he'll be my A, and then I'll use some B's in behind him, which would comprise the number 1 Next Revolt, the number 8 Alexander Helios, and the number 9 Pledge of Allegiance. And I guess I could throw in Craig's horse 10 Days Later as more of a C type, because I obviously see the path to victory for that horse. The more that I did some replay watching, I kind of came away with a negative opinion of him, but he obviously is one of the ones that could win this race. So not an easy sequence to put together, Craig, but as we've talked about in past sequences that have been pretty daunting, you really do want to just focus in on those value-based opinions and try to be right with that ticket that's going to pay.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I do. I play a ticket. Generally, all my tickets cost less than $100. We don't talk money on here very much because we're just giving out opinions. But I play smaller tickets trying to hit a big score. If it doesn't happen, so be it. In the long run, that if you hit one or two of these in a year, you can come out ahead. It's not a sequence that I would ever want to spend a bunch of money on, because you could easily still miss it because there are just so many directions you can go. So I want to stick to playing tickets where if I'm right, I get paid, and if not, I move on to next week. And this was a really fun card to handicap, I thought, at least the pick five. I haven't dug into the rest of it yet. I might even try to consider going to Oaklawn if it wasn't going to rain. That kind of threw a wrench in things there, though. But yeah, really fun card, and I'll be betting it from home for sure and looking forward to watching.
Yeah, we're very similar in the ways that I think we approach these sequences in our own play, Craig. I mean, I rarely spend more than $100 on these pick five sequences that we talk about. Sometimes the difficult ones are the ones that I feel strongly about will kind of creep up towards that. But I mean, I don't play caveman tickets. And when you start to really narrow things down using the ABC method that the legendary Steve Christ espoused and came up with and has written about, and if you really use it the right way by making the A's the horses that are the best value, B's the horses that you think are neutral value, and C's the horse that might take some value away from the sequence, but you think are ones that you want to use with those horses that are adding enough value to the sequence. If you use the ABC method that way, I think you're really on the right track, and you're going to come out ahead in the long run. It's not the easiest thing to do because you have to have a good opinion to employ that. But it really does cut down the cost of your ticket as opposed to trying to play a caveman ticket in a sequence like this, Craig, which could easily get way out of hand.
Yeah, and I like that you mentioned it again. I think I brought this up last week. I think a lot of times people say A's and B's and C's based on how much likely it is that the horses are going to win that they use, and that tends to lead to pretty chalky outcomes. I really like how you stated that your A's should be the horse where you think you're really going to get value. And that's something, I mean, I think I kind of did that already, but since you said it, I've really been thinking about it when I put tickets together.
Well, everybody, hopefully we've given out some good opinions on this podcast that help you put together a successful Pick 5 ticket at Oaklawn on Saturday. Everybody, thanks for tuning into the forecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. And Craig and I'll be back next week for the Pacecast, at least. I think I only got Craig for one podcast next week, but it'll be a stacked Pacecast because I think there'll be plenty of three-year-old stakes races for us to talk about, all of these Derby preps and everything else taking place around the country this first weekend in February. So everybody, good luck playing the races this weekend. And remember to catch that TimeformUS Pacecast coming up on Tuesday.